Imagine standing at the bottom of Black Canyon in 1931, staring up at sheer rock walls rising 800 feet above you. The temperature hovers at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. No safety harness exists. No modern hard hats. No OSHA regulations. Just a rope, a jackhammer, and the knowledge that 96 men will die here before this project ends. This is the story of how they built the Hoover Dam without modern safety standards, and the brutal human cost paid to tame the Colorado River. On April 20, 1931, the first worker died. His name was J.G. Tierney, a government surveyor who drowned in the Colorado River while conducting geological surveys. 13 years later, on December 20, 1935, the last recorded fatality occurred when Patrick Tierney, J.G. Tierney's son, fell to his death at the same location. Between these two deaths stretched 5 years of the most dangerous construction project America had ever attempted. The official count stands at 96 industrial fatalities. The real number, including those who died from heat exhaustion, pneumonia, carbon monoxide poisoning, and other work-related causes in nearby towns, remains unknown. Some historians estimate it reached 112 or higher. The Hoover Dam was never supposed to be built. Not really. Engineers in the 1920s looked at the violent, unpredictable Colorado River cutting through Black Canyon and declared it impossible. The canyon walls were too unstable. The summer heat too extreme. The remote location too inaccessible. The river carried too much silt and debris. Every technical analysis suggested waiting for better technology, better equipment, better understanding. Then came October 1929. The stock market collapsed. The Great Depression descended like a plague across America. Suddenly, the impossible became necessary. President Herbert Hoover approved the Boulder Canyon project in 1928, but construction didn't begin until 1931, after the Depression had devastated the nation. 21,000 men eventually worked on this project. Most arrived desperate, broken by economic catastrophe, willing to risk everything for $4 per day when millions had nothing. They came from failed farms in Oklahoma, shuttered factories in Detroit, collapsed banks in New York. They brought their families to a merciless desert where daytime temperatures exceeded 120 degrees, where water was rationed, where makeshift tent cities formed in the dust because the company town of Boulder City couldn't accommodate everyone fast enough. For many, this job was the difference between survival and starvation. That desperation would be exploited in ways that still shock the conscience. Before a single bucket of concrete could be poured, before the dam itself could take shape, one job had to be completed. The canyon walls had to be stripped of millions of tons of loose rock. Centuries of freezing water had cracked the stone. Summer heat had expanded those cracks. Entire sections of cliff face hung precariously, ready to collapse at any moment. If construction began without removing this unstable material, falling rocks would kill workers by the dozens. The solution was as brutal as it was brilliant: the high-scalers. These were special men. Former sailors accustomed to working on ship rigging hundreds of feet above deck. Circus acrobats who had performed death-defying stunts for crowds. Mohawk ironworkers from New York who had built skyscrapers while walking on beams no wider than a dinner plate. Apache and Navajo workers whose cultural traditions included scaling cliffs without equipment. What they all shared was a complete absence of fear when it came to heights and a willingness to do the most dangerous job on the entire project for $5.60 per day, just $1.60 more than standard laborers. The high-scalers would arrive at the canyon rim each morning before sunrise. They wore no harnesses. No safety belts. No protection except a single manila rope, typically 7/8 of an inch thick, tied around their waists. These ropes were lowered from the top of the 800-foot canyon walls. A high-scaler would grab his rope, wrap it once around his body, and step backward off the cliff edge into empty space. He descended hand over hand, controlling his speed by friction alone, loaded with 44-pound jackhammer drills, water bags, crowbars, and dynamite. The job was to drill holes into the unstable rock, pack them with explosives, light the fuse, and signal to be pulled up before the blast. Then they would descend again to lever free the shattered rock with crowbars, always with tons of unstable stone hanging above their heads. The dangers were constant and creative. Falling rocks killed more men than any other cause. When a scaler above you drilled into the cliff, rock chips rained down like bullets. When dynamite detonated, boulders the size of automobiles broke free and tumbled past workers hanging in midair. Live electrical lines snaked across the cliff faces, powering the jackhammers. Compressed air hoses whipped violently when connections failed. Bundles of drill steel swung like pendulums. High scalers had to navigate through this deadly maze while dangling from a single rope, operating heavy equipment with their hands, all while the desert sun turned the black rock into a radiant oven that could reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men passed out from heat exhaustion and hung limp on their ropes until coworkers could reach them. Some fell before anyone arrived. In the early months, workers died regularly from head injuries caused by falling rocks. Their cloth caps offered no protection whatsoever. Desperate for a solution, the high scalers began improvising. They took their canvas hats, soaked them in water, then dipped them repeatedly in coal tar and allowed them to harden in the sun. These hard-boiled hats created a crude but surprisingly effective helmet. Records show that several workers were struck so hard by falling rocks that their jaws broke from the impact transmitted through these improvised helmets, yet their skulls remained intact. They survived accidents that would have killed them instantly weeks earlier. When 6 companies incorporated, the consortium managing construction, heard about this innovation, they contracted with a mining equipment supplier to manufacture proper hard hats and issued them to every worker on the project. This was one of the first large-scale uses of industrial hard hats in American construction history. Deaths from falling objects decreased, but they never stopped. The high scalers developed a grim, fatalistic culture. When foremen weren't watching, they performed stunts. Contests emerged to see who could swing out the farthest from the cliff face, who could perform the most dangerous acrobatics, who had the steadiest nerves. Louis Fagan, known as the human pendulum, became legendary for transporting workers around a massive projecting boulder on the Arizona side. A crew member would wrap his legs around Fagan's waist, grab the rope, and the 2 men would leap into space together, swinging in a wide arc around the obstruction. Fagan made this journey 4 times per day for several weeks, carrying men out to their workstations in the morning and evening shifts. It was showmanship born from numbness to danger, a psychological adaptation to working in an environment where death arrived without warning. But perhaps the most famous moment in high scaler history came when they saved a government engineer's life in a daring midair rescue. Burl R. Rutledge, a Bureau of Reclamation engineer, was inspecting work near the canyon rim when he slipped and fell. 25 feet below, high scaler Oliver Cowan heard the scream and the scraping of boots on rock. Without hesitation, Cowan swung himself outward from the cliff face and grabbed Rutledge's leg as he fell past. Seconds later, another high scaler named Arnold Parks swung over and pinned Rutledge's body against the canyon wall with his own weight. The 2 men held the engineer suspended in midair until a rescue line could be lowered from above. Rutledge survived without injury. The high scalers received no bonus, no official recognition. They simply went back to work. While high scalers risked their lives on the canyon walls, another crew faced a different kind of hell. Before the dam could be built, the Colorado River had to be diverted. The solution was 4 massive tunnels, 2 on each side of the river, each 56 feet in diameter and 4,000 feet long, carved directly through the solid rock canyon walls. These diversion tunnels would redirect the river's flow around the construction site, allowing workers to build the dam in a dry riverbed. The scale was unprecedented. To give you perspective, these tunnels were large enough to drive 4 semi-trucks side by side through them with room to spare. Nothing this size had ever been excavated before. The tunneling crews worked in conditions that resembled something from Dante's Inferno. They drilled from both ends simultaneously, working toward each other through solid volcanic rock. Inside the tunnels, temperatures exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity approached 100%. The air filled with rock dust so thick that visibility dropped to a few feet. Workers wrapped wet bandanas around their faces, but the dust penetrated everything. Compressed air drills hammered continuously, creating a deafening roar that damaged hearing permanently. Dynamite blasts occurred multiple times per shift, filling the confined space with carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide fumes. Ventilation was primitive, inadequate, and often non-existent. Men died in these tunnels from causes that weren't classified as industrial fatalities. They suffocated from gas poisoning. They collapsed from heat stroke and were carried out unconscious, only to die hours or days later in makeshift medical facilities. They developed what was called tunnel sickness or gaseous poisoning, symptoms that included severe headaches, nausea, respiratory failure, and eventual death. Because they didn't die at the work site itself, these deaths weren't included in the official count of 96. The company classified them as natural causes or pre-existing health conditions. Families received no compensation. The tunneling proceeded at a brutal pace. Frank Crowe, the project's superintendent and a legendary figure in dam construction, drove his workers relentlessly. He implemented a 3-shift system that kept the drills running 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. He paid bonuses for speed but offered no extra money for safety improvements. The tunnels had to be completed by October 1, 1933, or 6 companies incorporated would face penalties of $3,000 per day. That deadline became an absolute imperative, and workers' lives became expendable variables in the equation. Records from the Bureau of Reclamation reveal that excavation of the 4 diversion tunnels required removing approximately 1.5 million cubic yards of rock. Workers drilled, blasted, and hauled debris at rates that engineering journals called impossible. They averaged 135 feet of tunnel advancement per week when the initial projections suggested 90 feet per week would be ambitious. This acceleration was achieved through human endurance pushed beyond reasonable limits. Shifts extended from 8 hours to 10, then 12. Rest periods shrank. Safety inspections were rushed or skipped entirely. When workers complained, they were fired and replaced within hours by men waiting desperately at the employment office gates. On November 13, 1932, the Colorado River was successfully diverted through the tunnels. It was an engineering triumph celebrated in newspapers across America. But the cost was measured in bodies that were buried quietly in Boulder City Cemetery, in men who survived but spent the rest of their shortened lives coughing blood into handkerchiefs, in children who grew up without fathers because the company valued speed over human life. With the river diverted and the canyon walls stripped of loose rock, construction of the dam itself could finally begin. On June 6, 1933, the first bucket of concrete was poured. This moment marked the beginning of what would become the most technically sophisticated concrete operation in human history. But it also began a new phase of danger for the workers. The dam would require 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to build a highway from New York to San Francisco. If poured continuously in a single massive block, engineers calculated that the concrete would take 125 years to cure and cool. The heat generated by the curing process would crack the structure into uselessness. The solution was to build the dam as a series of interlocking columns, each only 5 feet high, cooled by an elaborate system of 1-inch pipes through which refrigerated water flowed continuously. The concrete arrived at the work site in 8 cubic yard buckets suspended from a massive cableway system. Each bucket weighed 20 tons when full. These buckets swung across the canyon on steel cables, guided by operators who couldn't always see through the dust and steam rising from the construction site. Workers on the dam called themselves puddlers. 5 or 6 men worked each bucket, using long poles to guide it into position, then jumping into the wet concrete with shovels and vibrating tools to eliminate air pockets. The concrete would rise from 2 to 6 inches with each bucket, depending on the size of the column being filled. The work was relentless, mechanically repetitive, and incredibly dangerous. Buckets swung unpredictably in the wind. Cables snapped under strain, sending tons of concrete plummeting hundreds of feet. Men slipped on the wet, uneven surfaces and fell into fresh concrete, sometimes disappearing beneath the surface before coworkers could reach them. Contrary to popular urban legend, no one is buried in the Hoover Dam. The pouring process made it virtually impossible for a body to remain hidden. But that doesn't mean men didn't die in the concrete. It means their bodies were recovered, often after desperate, horrific efforts to dig them out before the concrete set. Some workers who fell into wet concrete survived with severe chemical burns. The lime in the concrete burned through clothing and skin. Men were pulled out screaming, their flesh dissolved by the alkaline mixture. The summer heat turned the construction site into a hell that defied description. Temperatures on the concrete reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Metal tools became too hot to touch with bare hands. Workers suffered heat exhaustion by the dozens every day. The company provided salt tablets and water, but it wasn't enough. Men collapsed and were dragged into the shade, where primitive first aid stations tried to cool them with wet rags and fans. Some recovered. Others died. The official records classified many of these deaths as heart failure or heat prostration, not industrial accidents, so they weren't included in the fatality count. This statistical manipulation allowed 6 companies incorporated to claim a better safety record than actually existed. Frank Crow, the dam's superintendent, was a genius of logistics and a ruthless driver of men. He had built dams before, Ararock Dam in Idaho, Teton Dam in Washington, but nothing approached the scale of Hoover. He implemented innovations that revolutionized large-scale concrete construction. He designed the railway system that delivered aggregate and cement. He invented the overhead cableway system that could deliver concrete buckets to any point on the dam with precision. He created the refrigeration system that cooled the concrete using ammonia refrigeration plants and miles of embedded pipes. These innovations made the project possible. They also killed men. Crow's philosophy was simple: speed above all. He paid his foremen bonuses based on the amount of concrete poured per shift, not on safety records. This created a culture where workers were pushed beyond exhaustion, where safety protocols were ignored, where complaints were met with termination. When workers attempted to organize and protest working conditions in August 1931, the company responded by firing every man suspected of union sympathies and blacklisting them from future employment. Replacement workers, even more desperate than those fired, were hired within hours. The message was clear: you are replaceable, and if you complain, someone hungrier will take your job. The cooling pipe system, while an engineering marvel, created its own hazards. Each column in the dam contained a network of 1-inch pipes through which ammonia-chilled water circulated. Workers had to place these pipes precisely as the concrete was poured, then connect them to the refrigeration system. Ammonia leaks occurred regularly. The gas was toxic and could be lethal in confined spaces. Men working deep inside the dam's structure sometimes encountered ammonia clouds and collapsed before they could escape. Rescue efforts in the maze-like interior were complicated and slow. Some workers died while rescuers struggled to find them in the labyrinth of columns and passageways. Falls from height were constant killers. The dam rose 726 feet from bedrock to crest, taller than a 60-story building. Workers scrambled across formwork, scaffolding, and partially completed surfaces that were slick with water, concrete residue, and oil. Railings were minimal or non-existent. Safety lines were rare. When a man fell, there was usually nothing to stop him until he hit solid concrete or water hundreds of feet below. The impact was invariably fatal. Drowning claimed lives even after the river was diverted. Water accumulated at the bottom of the construction site from groundwater seepage and spillage. Deep pools formed in low areas. Workers who fell into these pools, sometimes unconscious from other injuries, drowned before help arrived. The swirling currents in the diversion tunnels caught men who ventured too close to inspect progress or clear debris. Bodies were sometimes recovered days later, miles downstream. The human stories behind the statistics reveal a pattern of systemic exploitation. Most workers were migrants, many were immigrants, and a significant number were racial minorities who faced additional discrimination. The workforce included African American workers who were paid less than white workers for identical jobs and relegated to the most dangerous tasks. Native American workers, including Navajo and Apache high scalers, received the same discriminatory treatment. Chinese and Mexican laborers faced similar prejudices. The company knew these men had fewer options, less social power, and were less likely to complain about conditions. Workers lived in company-controlled housing in Boulder City, a town built specifically for the project. Rent was deducted directly from paychecks. Food was purchased at company stores at inflated prices. Medical care was provided by company doctors who often minimized injuries to avoid compensation claims. This system created a form of economic bondage where workers, despite earning wages, remained perpetually in debt to the company. Those who couldn't secure housing in Boulder City lived in Ragtown, a sprawling tent city in the desert where families endured 120-degree heat with no running water, no electricity, and no sanitation. Children died there from dysentery, dehydration, and disease. These deaths, too, were not included in any official statistics. The Hoover Dam was completed on March 1, 1936, 2 years ahead of schedule. President Franklin D. Roosevelt dedicated it on September 30, 1935, though concrete was still being poured at the time. The final cost was $49 million, approximately $940 million in today's dollars, which was under budget. It was hailed as a triumph of American engineering and ingenuity, a symbol of what could be achieved through determination and hard work. Newspapers celebrated it as a monument to human progress. Engineers studied it as a masterpiece of design. The public marveled at its scale and beauty. But beneath that triumph lay 96 officially acknowledged deaths, and perhaps dozens more that were never counted. Behind the soaring concrete and the elegant Art Deco design were men who died because safety equipment was considered too expensive, because schedules mattered more than lives, because desperate workers in a depression economy could be worked to death and immediately replaced. The dam stands today as one of the most visited tourist attractions in America. More than 7 million people tour it every year. They see the massive structure, learn about the engineering innovations, admire the strength of the concrete. They take selfies in front of the intake towers. They walk across the crest and feel the power of Lake Mead contained behind the wall. Most have no idea of the blood that soaked into the desert floor during its construction. The tour guides mention the 96 deaths, usually in passing, as a historical footnote. The monument to the workers is a bronze statue of high scalers, unveiled in 1995, 6 decades after the dam was completed. It stands as a belated acknowledgement of what should have been recognized from the beginning. This dam was built on the bodies of disposable men. What lessons did we learn? In the immediate aftermath, not many. Large construction projects continued to prioritize speed and cost over worker safety. It wasn't until the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, 34 years after the Hoover Dam was completed, that federal workplace safety standards became mandatory in the United States. Today, a project of this scale would require safety harnesses, hard hats, guardrails, safety nets, regular inspections, mandatory rest periods, heat stress protocols, and comprehensive medical care. Modern fatality rates on large construction projects, while not zero, are dramatically lower. A project the size of Hoover Dam built today would be expected to complete with single-digit fatalities, if any at all. But here's the uncomfortable truth: we still build on the backs of vulnerable workers. The construction industry in 2026 still has one of the highest workplace fatality rates of any sector in America. Immigrant workers, often undocumented, still face exploitation and dangerous conditions because they fear deportation more than they fear injury. Workers in developing countries build infrastructure under conditions that would be illegal in the United States. The smartphones in our pockets, the clothes on our backs, the electronics in our homes, many were assembled by people working in conditions not far removed from what Hoover Dam workers endured. The specifics change. The fundamental dynamic remains. The Hoover Dam continues to generate electricity for Nevada, Arizona, and California. It provides water for agriculture in cities across the Southwest. Lake Mead, the reservoir it created, is the largest in the United States by volume. The dam has delivered on every promise made in 1931. It was an engineering success, an economic success, a political success. It demonstrated that America could accomplish monumental projects even in the depths of economic collapse. But when you look at the dam today, knowing what you now know about how it was built, what do you see? Do you see a triumph of human ingenuity? Or do you see a monument to human disposability? Do you celebrate the innovation and determination it represents? Or do you mourn the 96 men who died, and the unknown number of others whose deaths were never officially counted, whose families received no compensation, whose sacrifices were minimized or ignored? These questions matter, because we are still building dams. We are still constructing infrastructure. We are still making decisions about whose lives we consider expendable in pursuit of progress. The workers who built the Hoover Dam had no choice. They were trapped by economic desperation in a system that exploited their vulnerability. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, not as acceptable losses, but as individuals who paid with their lives for a project that benefited millions while costing them everything. Their story should make us uncomfortable. It should force us to ask hard questions about the price of progress, about whose labor we exploit, about which lives we value. Because until we truly reckon with the human cost of what we build, we will continue repeating the same pattern, celebrating monuments while forgetting the men who died creating them. The question now is, what do we owe them? What do we owe to the workers, past and present, whose labor builds the infrastructure we depend on? Do we owe them acknowledgement? Do we owe them better protection? Do we owe their descendants compensation for lives lost to corporate profit? These aren't easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they are questions we must ask if we want to claim that we've learned anything from history. The Hoover Dam will stand for centuries. The men who built it are gone. Their names are carved in bronze, but their stories are fading from memory. Don't let them disappear. Remember what it cost. Remember who paid the price. Share your thoughts below.